This broadcast of the Hamptons Institute at Guildhall is being brought to you by Bridgehampton National Bank.
Thank you for being here on this absolutely beautiful day. We're truly appreciative of your support and participation. We're delighted that you've chosen to join the second annual Hamptons Institute Summer Program. The program addresses a wide variety of important subjects, among them the arts, the economy, foreign affairs, politics, and the media. I'm especially grateful to the 20 experts who will join us over the next couple of days to share their insights and expertise in their various fields. And if you would please refer to your program, we have biographies on each of them. My thanks especially to the Roosevelt Institute for their dedicated collaboration and to the Tarr family for their continued support of this program. And our appreciation to Chubb Insurance and their cornerstone agent, Dayton, Ritz, and Osborne, for lead sponsorship of the Hamptons Institute. My thanks also to the fellows and the senior fellows who have been so generous to participate at that higher level. And I am very grateful to Ellen Chesler for her contributions as a brilliant program director and a wonderful human being. We love working with Ellen. Thank you very much, Ellen. And also to Mickey Strauss, the chairman of the Guildhall Board, who was so inspiring in his leadership. Thank you. And to Tracy Marshall, who is the program coordinator and has organized all of these 20 speakers and this whole program. She's done a wonderful job. We're also very grateful to WVVH, our local media sponsor, and all of the panels will be available through Guildhall's website and on YouTube. And during our lunch break from 12:30 to 2:30, I encourage you to stop by the galleries. We are also a very, very important museum, having an exhibition of a sculpture by the artist Brian Hunt and a photography exhibition by Clifford Ross. You're welcome to stop in and take a look. Now I am pleased to introduce Karen Greenberg, Dan Yerkin, Congresswoman Harman, and Hisham Melhem. Thank you.
Thank you for giving up some sun to be with us. And I want to thank Ellen Chesler for including this topic, which is a rather brave one to try to accomplish any discussion of in an hour and a half. But we have assembled a group that I know can enlighten you and answer some of the questions you might have. I'm not going to introduce them because apparently you have their bios, but let me give a general introduction for why we chose to put these people on the panel, which is that there are very few people that can have the talent to do what these three people do. And that is both to immerse themselves in a given series of topics and become experts, and at the same time have the care and the consideration to introduce it and explain it to the public, and not just to people in Washington and not just to policymakers, but to passionately care that Americans understand the issues in front of them and are willing to not just research and amass information, which is what I think we really like to do, but explain it to you. And so I am thrilled to have these people on the stage, and I don't think you could have a better panel on this. Having said that, I'd like to start a little bit personally with each one of them and ask them a question that is not exactly pertinent to the Middle East, but pertinent to who they are and how they think about it. And so I thought I'd begin with Jane Harman, who, as you know, in her years in Congress, was known for her work with the armed services, armed forces, her work on the Intelligence Committee, her work on Homeland Security, and a variety of other things that may be ancillary in their importance to what we're talking about today. She's traveled throughout the world. She's been to many of the countries we'll be talking about. And my question to her is, so how did you get so interested in security before the rest of us?
Well, thank you. First, let me acknowledge my relatives in the room, Bonnie Reese and my son, Brian Frank. I think Rick Reese may be here too, but he may be playing golf. Bonnie and I share two perfect grandsons, the younger of whom has doubled in volume in the last 3 or 4 weeks since I saw him last, so I love being here and getting to play with them and with their two cousins. So I'm a doting grandmother. That's more important to me than I think anything. You've got to understand that. So how did this happen to me? I've always had an interest in foreign affairs, and I have over the years, before I ran for Congress, which was in 1992, which was the first elected office I'd ever sought after junior high school treasurer, which I lost. But at any rate, I always had an interest in foreign affairs, and I spent many years after graduating law school in Washington working in political jobs, 5 years for California Senator John Tunney, where I was legislative director and then chief counsel, and then 2 years in the Carter White House as the deputy cabinet secretary, and then a year as special counsel to the Defense Department. After that, I practiced law endlessly. My late husband said I never got it right, but finally I ran for Congress in the Aerospace Center of Los Angeles, very close to where I grew up, and that's how I really honed my interest in security issues. That district, the 36th District of California, makes most of our intelligence satellites, and I figured out pretty early, before I got elected, that if I wanted to be elected as a Democrat in a lean Republican seat, I better know the issues and get the aerospace executives and hopefully workforce on my side, and that's what I did. And so I served on all the security committees in Congress over 9 terms, 17 years, which is how long I was in Congress, left end of February. In dog years is 119 years. I want you to know that. It was a long time. And I know you're going to ask me later why I left, so I'm not going to tell any of you yet. But I did travel everywhere, and I think every single country we're going to discuss I have been to many times. I actually have met with Muammar Gaddafi in his tent in Sirte. I'm not kidding. And I've been to North Korea.
Goodness, as I said, everybody, we could have an hour and a half for everyone here. So now, Dan, I don't know that much about you, except that, I had to read your books when I was in graduate school, and that was really pleasurable, I must say. But now I notice you have a new book coming out. So I only can pick up one thing. The book you won the Pulitzer Prize for was called The Prize. I'm assuming because you wanted prizes for it, but now I notice the new one is called The Quest. So my question to you is, can you only have books with 5-letter words?
Well, thank you, and let me say also on behalf of my wife Angela and I, we're very pleased to be part here and to be guests of Mickey and Layla and Ellen and Matt, and to be part of this program. Well, on the title, originally actually I wanted to have an 11-word title for this new book, but Harry Potter was already taken, so I reverted to 5 letters, and I think originally the prize was going to be called The Prize of the Venture, which was a quote from Churchill explaining why he'd converted the British Navy before World War I from coal to oil, because he said the prize of the venture was world mastery, and I really took that to be the theme of the prize. And then when I would say the prize of the venture, no one would understand me, and they said the prize of the adventure or the price of the dentures. So we shortened it to the prize. There was a problem that I think Irving Wallace or somebody had written a thriller called The Prize many decades ago, and I was worried about that, but you can't copyright a title. The only downside of calling it The Prize is occasionally in the early days I'd go in bookstores and find this book about oil was filed in the fiction section, which was very nerve-wracking. And so having found that the prize worked pretty well and you could remember it, it just seemed like a really good idea to have another title that was the something. And this new book really is about the quest for energy and security and for the environmental objectives and how complicated it is to achieve all of them.
Okay, and next what you're going to work on after this? After you get done, you've gone from oil to energy security. What's next? Do you have a sense?
Got to publish this first.
Okay, well, just
September 20th.
Just a little clue that I'm going to push you a little bit today.
Maybe I'll get some ideas here. Thanks.
Okay, Hisham, Melhem, I think most people know you from television. They know you as the Washington bureau chief of Al Arabiya. I'm curious if you could just tell this audience a little bit how satellite news, something that came during your career, what you actually think about its benefits and perhaps its non-benefits. And we will get to this in terms of the Middle East conflict. And so just generally how you think.
Yeah. The Middle East and mainly the Arab world has 600 satellite stations, 600. Unfortunately, most Arabs, like most Americans, get their news from television. And as an old hand in print media, I lament that. But most people know you because you are on television, not necessarily because they read you. Very few people read seriously these days. So television is a fact of life. Satellite television is a new phenomenon in the Arab world. Most Arabs discovered satellite television after the first Gulf War, when every official in the region was mesmerized watching CNN to follow the news. And then a creative businessman from Saudi Arabia decided to established the first satellite station in 91, 92, and he established it in London, called the Middle East Broadcasting Center in London. And the rest is history, as they said. And now, not only Arabs are creating these new satellite stations and competing, but there is something unique about the Middle East. This is the only area in the world where all major powers, including the United States, Russia, China, Germany, France, have satellite stations in Arabic that are directed at the Arab world to influence hearts and minds in the Arab world. There is no other region in the world that is treated that way. And only the Chinese recently were the latecomers, and now they have their own Arabic-speaking satellite station to cover the Arab world. The satellite phenomena is unique. Some satellite stations like Al Arabiya and Al Jazeera and Nile Television, LBC in Lebanon, they have a tremendous influence in shaping public opinion, shaping attitudes. And for the first time, Arabs used to read about other Arab countries by watching CNN or Sky or reading foreign papers. Now, for the first time, they watch Arab television in Arabic, through Arab lenses, if you will, that tell them about Arab stories. And in the last few years, particularly during the so-called Arab Spring, we've seen, especially in the case of Egypt, the revolution in Egypt, it was covered live on Al Arabiya and Al Jazeera, blow by blow, day by day, hour by the hour. And it's fascinating to see the influence of these satellite stations in shaping public opinion. And if you remember, from Ben Ali, the president of Tunisia, Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, Bashar al-Assad in Syria, Ali Abdullah Saleh in Yemen, all of them at one time or another blamed the Arab satellite stations for their problems. And this is, on the whole, is a healthy phenomena. At the same time, there is a great deal of there are some aspects of it that disturbs me because it can be used to incite people, it can be used to exaggerate, it can be used to, especially in societies that are not very well open, where you don't have the rule of law, they can be responsible for spreading all sorts of stereotypes, conspiracy theories and whatnot. So that's the dark side of it, if you will. But on the whole, the phenomena is healthy. But it's really unique, as I said, that all major powers now are focused on this region, and there's a satellite war going on there. And
let me interrupt there because I want to ask you the first questions that's specifically addressed to our topic, and it's great to have these news feeds, but they come in real time. They're unvetted for the most part, unedited even to a large part during the Arab uprisings, so-called uprisings. So it's left to the rest of you to consolidate the information, to do it quickly. And I'd like you to I know this is hard, but I'd like you to give a kind of overview from your perspective of how you would distinguish between the various uprisings that have gone on, whether you want to, I'm curious about 3 countries. I think we'll get to Libya later, but I'm curious about Syria, Egypt, and Yemen, and sort of how you see them as archetypical and pivotal in this chain of events. Just
now, all Arab countries have a lot in common. They all speak the same language, and they have a lot in commonalities in history, but they are different too. I mean, very different in terms of social structure, degree of economic social development, you name it. Egypt and Tunisia are different than the rest, in part because Egypt and Tunisia are essentially homogeneous societies. Egypt has a great sense of identity. It's a 7,000-year history. Its pre-Islamic history is fantastic. Its Islamic history is very rich. Tunisia has been stable for a long time. There is a sense of identity. It's a homogeneous society. And there was no chance for a civil war in Egypt, and no chance for a civil war in Tunisia. Both the Egyptian military and the Tunisian military do not have a history of shooting at their own people, which is not the case in Syria, Iraq under Saddam Hussein, or in Yemen, or in Sudan, or in other countries. The nature of that, of the homogeneous societies in Egypt and in Tunisia made it easier for the opposition to articulate, sets of political grievances. It was difficult for the ruling parties to exploit divisions within society as Bashar al-Assad did in Syria, or in Ali Abdullah Saleh in Yemen, other places. So the fact that these societies are homogeneous helped the Arab Spring. When you look at other societies, Libya, Syria, Yemen, Bahrain, Iraq, Sudan, Lebanon, they are heterogeneous societies. And you have tribal, ethnic, regional, sectarian cleavages that are usually exploited by the leadership to maintain power and to divide society. And that's what we've seen now in Syria and in Bahrain. I mean, give you an example. In my country of birth, I was born in Lebanon. All politics in Lebanon, unfortunately, are reduced to sectarianism. If you go to Iraq, you might meet a very sophisticated Iraqi, and then you scratch him a little bit, and then you discover that you're talking to a Sunni Arab, or a Shia Arab, or a Kurd, or a Turkmen. You don't have that in Egypt. All Egyptians are comfortable with their own sense of identity and their history. Sudan is breaking up because of the nature of the society. In Yemen, it is very difficult for the opposition to come up with one unified set of grievances, because there are regional differences between North and South, there are tribal differences, and there are sectarian differences. The same in Syria. In Syria, you have a minority rule, but 12% of the population, ruling over a majority of Sunni Muslim Arabs. And then you have Kurds. You have about 3 million Kurds in Syria. You have 2 million Christians. You have Armenians. You have Ismailis. You have Druze. It's a very complex human mosaic that did not exist or doesn't exist in Egypt and in Tunisia. And that's why it was easier somewhat in Tunisia and in Egypt to get rid of the political leadership in relatively short time, in few weeks, 3 weeks in Egypt, and probably a month or 5 weeks in Tunisia. Now, the difficulty here is that, particularly in Egypt, it is true that they got rid of the tip of the pyramid, the political leadership, Mubarak and his cronies and his family. But the structure that supported Mubarak for 30 years, the security structure, economic structure, political structure, even the cultural structure, if you want to call it like a pyramid, that pyramid is still there. And that's why it's not over in Egypt. The easiest thing was to get rid of the political leadership. The toughest thing is how to chip away at that structure, that pyramid that supported Mubarak for 30 years. And this is going to take a long time. And now we are going to go through a long, complex, bumpy, transitional period in which we're going to see all sorts of phenomena. And the entrenched forces in society, whether they are in the military, in the traditional bastions of society, the Islamists, The people who don't want to see real change are fighting back. There is a counter-revolution now. And the youth who led the revolution or led the uprising early on are going back to Tahrir Square and to other places to continue the struggle. They don't want to see their uprising or their revolution, peaceful revolution essentially, hijacked either by the military or by the Islamists or by other traditional forces in society. So the story in Egypt is not over. The story in Tunisia is not over. But it was relatively easier in those two societies in particular because of the nature of the society. In Syria, it might degenerate into a civil war. In Yemen, the same. In Libya now, we have a civil war essentially taking place in which NATO is involved in it. And you know how messy it is. And the longer the situation is not settled in places like Yemen, you have the threat of Yemen being breaking up between north and south. You have the threat of large swath of Yemeni territory being under the control of either tribes or Al-Qaeda and other groups. And the central government, which is also, to begin with, weak, it will become even weaker. In Syria, there is the threat of a sectarian fight between the Alawis and the Sunnis. This is extremely dangerous. While we were all, at least in my case, very optimistic, and I don't want to sound like a Cassandra, preaching doom and gloom, but I'm not as enthusiastic today as I was a few months ago about the Arab Spring, because I see it in some places morphing not only into a hot summer, but probably a dark winter.
Goodness. Well, Dan, I know you're going to cheer us up. For those of us who are not experts on the Middle East, but who get involved in conversations where at the dinner table, at a cocktail party, somebody always comes up to you and says, look, it's really about oil. It's about resources. You think it's about politics. I know it's about what Hisham is talking about. But what is the role of the resource issue in the way this is playing out? And why does it matter to us? I think one of the things that comes across all the time is it's over there. It's over there. And really, what is the cost analysis for us? And I don't mean to be myopic, but allow me.
Sure. I'm struck, well, to start with one part of what Hisham was talking about, Yemen. I mean, the two packages that Saudi intelligence tipped the United States off to that did not go off on a FedEx plane and a UPS plane arriving in the United States or originated in Yemen. The Fort Hood shooting was masterminded from Yemen. I believe the Times Square bomber. Yeah. So you have a very strong Al-Qaeda there. Some think the strongest affiliate. So it is of very great significance. And it also shares an 1,100-mile border with Saudi Arabia, a rather porous border. So what happens in Yemen, in that very fragmented and most populous country, as you pointed out, on the Arabian Peninsula, will be very significant for countries on the peninsula, but it will also be very significant for us. On the question of the role of resources, i.e. oil and natural gas, it looms very large. About 60% of world oil reserves are in the Persian Gulf, in that rather concentrated region. And so that's not all of the story by any means. And I think but it's an important part of the story, obviously. And the interplay now between those countries that are the haves, that do have oil and gas revenues, and those that do not is going to be an important part of the story. And it goes back to Egypt, which had 5% economic growth before this started. Will probably have 0% economic growth. What foreign investor is going to invest in Egypt now? Capital flight from Egypt. So there's going to be, after the expectations have been raised, when the economic situation actually gets worse, then part of the question is going to be, well, who's going to step in with funding to keep those governments going? And we see it's going to be if it is going to be anybody in a really significant way, it's going to come from the oil exporters. And so it's about oil and resources, but it's also about money.
And so the oil exporters, to be clear, are?
Well, it's led by Saudi Arabia. The Abu Dhabi, Qatar is the source of your competitor. Al Jazeera is the powerhouse of world natural gas. It's obviously Iran, which is a separate story, and in terms of what they're going to be doing. It's Kuwait. Those are the countries that are really the welfare states that have the resources. And just to add one thing, that we saw King Abdullah announced in the wake of all of this turmoil, suddenly, in effect, their version of a stimulus program is $131 billion, which if you gross it up for our population would be well over $2 trillion to domestic spending to, enable young men to buy houses so they could get married and all that sort of thing. Then the other call on their treasury is going to be for what will they do or not do for countries like Egypt, where the country, basically, Egypt can run out of foreign reserves.
You were supposed to cheer us up. So you failed.
Jane will
so
do
I'm
that.
going to let Jane cheer us up.
That's Jane's job.
And my question to Jane, but feel free to come in at any point you want, is how prepared was our U.S. Congress for the problems presented by the Arab uprisings? And what is the learning curve that we're going to have to develop through in the next little while? How big is the gap between the problem and our understanding of it at the national level?
Well, let me say a few things. First of all, I misspoke. The Times Square bomber was trained in Pakistan. It was Abdul Muttalib, it was the Nigerian with the underwear bomber, who the bomb came from Yemen. And he was in Yemen and was trained, obviously not well enough, fortunately, for that event. At any rate, I think Yemen is ground zero. I just want to put that out there in terms of threats against us, because it is a failing state. The head of the state, Saleh, is supposed to return tomorrow, which is the 33rd anniversary of his rule. Let's see if the Saudis let him out. But he's there recovering from serious burns because his palace in Yemen was bombed or attacked. I think it burned down because of the uprisings in Yemen. And I think I'm right. Yemen is running out of oil. It's running out of water. It has 135,000 little towns that have absolutely no resources whatsoever. Whatever water is left is used to grow khat. Khat is a marijuana-like substance which the men of Yemen wear on their shoulders. It's just a hopeless place, at least at the moment. So that's the downer. Here's the upper. This is a new book called Rock the Casbah. It's written by Robin Wright. She's a former Los Angeles Times reporter, has written in many journals, a very brilliant woman. And this was, of course, written at the Woodrow Wilson Center, where I'm now president and CEO. But her point is that there is a counter-jihad, you might agree with this, going on in many of these societies. Counter-jihad is what we would like to happen, which is Muslims in these countries are rising up against the sort of al-Qaeda hardline types. I don't know how to characterize them, but that'll do. And she documents this country by country, and she thinks this is how, over a decade or so, the bad guys are going to lose. You wanted to know about Congress, so let me just answer that. I don't think it just applies to Congress. I think it applies to the administrations that we've had on a bipartisan basis and to most Americans. I think there is incredible ignorance about Arab societies. And I think I mean, it was a gaffe, but about 5 or 6 years ago, the incoming chairman of the House Intelligence Committee was asked the difference between Sunni and Shia. And he said, gee, it's late on a Friday afternoon, I'll have to get back to you. That is about the level of sophistication, or was, in Congress. And I think when we, that includes me, took some action against Iraq, I personally believed that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. I think our understanding of Iraq, mine, was extremely shallow. You know, it's been a quick education, but I think it's still true. From the prism of a U.S. legislator, and maybe this isn't fair, maybe this is defensive, but I'll say it anyway. I don't know that we have to fully understand these societies. I think we have to have a pretty good understanding of what the U.S. interest is, what U.S. interests are at stake. We're not driving this Arab Spring. This is a bottom-up, mostly nonviolent response by people living in these countries to years of disrespect and unfair treatment. And when the fruit vendor immolated himself, Bouazizi, in Tunisia, he was being forced to pay a bribe. I think you should all know this story. I mean, it's a horrible story. And of $7, I think, in order to get his license and keep his fruit stand open. And he protested to the government and couldn't get anywhere. And it was, you know, at a moment of hopelessness that he doused himself in gasoline, burned himself, and lingered in a hospital for weeks. But later that day, his family came and threw the $7 over the wall of the palace, you know, in outrage at how he'd been treated. And that was, most people think, the sort of spark that went across social media, across the region, across the world, and led to not identical uprisings, but related uprisings across the region. So it's a bottom-up movement. It does not have much to do with Al-Qaeda, and it does not have much to do with us. We are not in a position to determine the outcome in any of these places. We can try to help shape it, but we can't control it, which is something I think we're learning slowly. But I think what we have to learn is what our interests are in these different countries. And I think at a time of scarce resources, financial resources, and certainly a finite number of people in our military, we need to choose very carefully where we will intervene. And I don't think our choices have been as careful as they should have been. We're going to get to Libya, but I wouldn't have put Libya on my list.
Before we get to Libya, put on your list for what? For intervention? Yeah, of course. So I just want to get to this counter-narrative, because there's a lot of distrust about the counter-narrative, meaning, you know, are we being spun that there is a counter-narrative? Is there a need for a counter-narrative? Does it make it that the perceived Islamist movements, like the Muslim Brotherhood, are less powerful than we might think? And you know, the counter-narrative, as far as I understand it, when I first came across it, was in Yemen. And I've always been somewhat suspicious of it. Just to be frank, you know, I think it's kind of an interesting thing. But, you know, the idea, you don't understand jihad because it's really nonviolent. And if you really understood it, you would understand jihad is nonviolent. I think that's a very, it's very hard for us to participate in that conversation. So I'm curious how you see this idea of a counter-narrative. And
what was fascinating about the Arab uprising was the fact that it was not driven, initially at least, in the initial stage, by any meta-narrative. This was not driven by a sense of Islamism. This was not driven by a sense of anti-imperialism. This was not driven by a sense of anti-Zionism. This was not driven by any sense of to restore Arab nationalism or as an anti-Western narrative. I have not seen one single American flag being burned, or for that matter, an Israeli flag being burned, which is a fascinating thing. This was an Arab drama. It is played out by Arabs, and hopefully it will be determined and reach good conclusions by Arabs. I don't know, we will see. Nobody can tell. Obviously later on, the Islamists and other groups, as you would expect, joined the fray, so to speak. In Egypt, the old Islamist traditional groups, the leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood or the Salafis, were on the sideline. And the movement was led by middle-class types, highly educated, people who are wired, who are involved in social media. I mean, one of them is Wa'il Ghanem, who is an executive at Google. These These people speak English. Many of them went to the American University in Cairo. They are plugged in, and they want to partake in the modern world. And Egypt, unlike Yemen, for instance, is part of a globalized economy. Now, obviously, in a place like Egypt, where the Muslim Brotherhood was established back in 1928, where various governments in Egypt, whether under the monarchy or under the republic rule, drove these Islamists underground, mistreated them, tortured them. I mean, when you listen to Ayman Zawahiri, who's the second man in Al-Qaeda, and you hear the horror stories that happened to him. Now, granted, he's a nasty fellow, but the way they were treated was really terrible. And they were driven underground, and that's why they were reluctant to play publicly, to play politics the way we understand politics. Now, they have been divided. The younger generation within the Islamists are not necessarily beholden to the old ideas of the old generation. I think many of them would live with peace with Israel. Many of them do not see the West as the way Osama bin Laden or Ayman Zawahir and all of these guys see it as the embodiment of evil or decadence. And now there is a huge debate within the Islamists. And while put my own prejudices aside as a fanatic secularist, I would have to tell you this phenomena is part of Arab life, Arab political life, and we have to accept it and we have to deal with it. And there is a debate among these Islamists. The United States cannot determine that, but I think the United States cannot determine the outcome in any of these uprisings. Although now we are involved in a war in Libya, in the end, the United States should stick to certain principles. And whether we like it or not, the United States, for many people in the region, is omnipresent and omniscient. And whatever the American president says or whatever the American Congress does, people watch that very carefully. So not only it's crucial for us to understand American interests there, but at least it's crucial for us to stick to certain principles. And I think saying that we are for democratic change, for accountability, for pluralism, for inclusion, for women's rights, for minority rights, these are principles. These are not American, these are universal principles, and if we stick to them, I don't think we would lose, even if we have some problems with some of these movements there or some of these groups. So this is really crucial for the United States to be clear. I mean, clarity in foreign politics is important. I mean, during the Bush administration, we waged a war against terror. It was a terrible mistake. The way it was conceptualized was wrong. Bush engaged in all sorts of stuff about, Islamofascism and evildoers, and he spoke in a metaphysical, religious language, which was really terrible, because it did reflect the metaphysical language of these radicals in the Arab world, black and white. This is like a Manichaean world, evil versus good, light versus darkness, and all that. There is no reason for that. We have enemies in the region. Al-Qaeda is an enemy. Those who are, instead of saying we are waging war against terrorism, we should have said we are waging a war against Al-Qaeda. This is a merciless war. We're going to chase them till the end of this earth. Anybody who is like-minded, they are our enemies. But we don't care about a debate among Islamists in Egypt or Tunisia. If somebody is going to tell me, I want my politics in the Arab world to be informed by Islamic values, the way the Christian Democrats in Europe would say, I want our politics to be informed by Christian values, or in Israel, I want my politics to be informed by Jewish values. I have no problem with that. Having Islamist theocracies is another thing. And I don't happen to believe that those who say Al-Islam huwa al-hal, that Islam is the solution, have the answers. And I think the United States should push those societies to open enough of a space for various groups and societies to compete. You are not going to defeat terrorism by coercive means alone. You defeat terrorism by not making it appealing in those societies. And you have to have a debate among Muslims. It is not the job of the United States or an American official or a member of Congress to tell me what is the exact meaning of jihad or counter-jihad or whatever. I mean, when people tell me, well, jihad doesn't mean this or don't get involved in that. I know the Quran, I can read it in Arabic, and I can debate those people, and that's what I do, by the way. And that's what I do. But we have to help our friends in the region, and we have many friends in the region if we know how to deal with them. And it is up to them to engage those groups in a debate. In a place like Egypt or in Tunisia, where you have more or less open societies where you can debate these things, these are the groups that we have to help. And by sticking to these principles and try to be consistent. I mean, the president had a difficulty, President Obama, when he was supporting the goal of the uprising in Egypt, when he was dealing with Bahrain. Bahrain represented the problem. In Bahrain, you have a situation that is untenable. You have 30% of the Sunnis ruling over 70% Shia population. And those people are discriminated against systematically in Bahrain. And Bahrain is the place where we have the headquarters of the Fifth Fleet. It's been there since 1949. And every time the majority are asking for certain demands or reforms or getting away with these discriminatory practices, the government says Iran is behind it. Iran is not behind it. Iran is exploiting it after the explosion. And the same thing last year in Yemen. We had a war waged by the central government in Yemen against a group called the Houthis in northern Yemen, close to the Saudi border. And the Yemenis kept telling us here that Iran is behind it, which was not the case. And I have never heard an American official tell me that the Houthi rebellion in Yemen was caused by Iran. Now, later on, if Iran exploits it, well, that's natural. They would do that. But, so it is difficult for us sometimes to be consistent when it comes to these governments, because some of them have been close to us. And some of them supported us. I mean, Mubarak supported us in Afghanistan during the fight against the Soviet Union, supported us in Africa and other places. But then, we looked the other way when he and our allies, other allies in the Middle East and in the Muslim world, were engaged in the worst, violation of human rights of their own people. And I think, people see that. They see the double standards, and I think we should be consistent at least, and to be clear.
Linda, could I just make one comment on that and just basically express violent agreement with what you said? But here's my comment. To win in this long-term struggle, not against terror, terror is a tactic. War against terror really doesn't mean anything, but against Al-Qaeda and very extreme radical groups that employ terrorism as a tactic, we have to win the argument. Playing whack-a-mole and just killing off people will not win the argument. In fact, I was on the Bill Maher show about 3 weeks ago, and he said, so Jane, we're bombing in 5 Muslim countries, and he named them, and he said, that's a lot of countries. Wouldn't 3 be enough? And the point is, why are we doing this? What does the U.S. stand for? And if we could do a much better job of getting our narrative out there about what we stand for, we will have a much better chance of winning the argument with the next generation that it can either put on a suicide vest or, have a bomb in their underwear, or hopefully can join can go to school, a real school, and lead a productive role in a resurgent, let's hope, Egyptian economy, which is a possible outcome here.
But it does get to the bottom line here, which is if you have societies that are crumbling financially, people who are out of food, people who are out of water, people whose societies are now being destroyed by violence, even if it's not as much violence as we might have anticipated. What does this mean? And so this is a question, I think, for you, which is that we're dealing with a lot of transnational global forces. And when we talk about terrorism, we call them transnational. When we talk about economic forces, we call them global. Actually, we're talking about, cross-border global issues, whether they are violence, or the economy. And I guess the question is, how fragile is the world economy as a direct result of what's going on in the Middle East? And also, in terms of our government deciding to support the rebels, or the insurgents, or whatever we're going to call them this week, what does it mean in terms of understanding their access to the resources that those countries have? And how do you, so this is a large question, but how do you assess all that?
So the second part of your question is about Libya specifically,
yes.
Right? So we'll come back to that. But in terms of the economics, there are 2 things to keep in mind right now. We're not so aware of it in this country, But what's happening to food prices around the world is really a huge problem. Food prices spiked in 2008 to the highest levels of ever, came down, and now they're way above where they were in 2008. That the discontent, the anger, it's not only about lack of participation and dignity, but it's really the economic hardship. And this is a problem around the world. I mentioned to Karen last night, a couple of weeks ago, I was in St. Petersburg at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum. And after the Russian president spoke, the Chinese president spoke, and he said there are three big issues we have: climate change, energy security, and food security. So it's happening in China too. We can get into why this is happening, the change of diet. Half the pork in the world is eaten in China. I mean, the growth of these economies. So that's one part. The other part, and it kind of goes back to what Hisham was talking about, is that in one way, of course, this region is globalized. It's, in terms of energy supply, and many other ways it wasn't and hasn't been, and there's been a greater resistance. And the thing that brings it home to me is 1960, Egypt, South Korea, and Taiwan had about the same per capita income. Today, South Korea and Taiwan each export more into the world economy in 2 days than Egypt does in a year. So there's a sense in which these countries have not become part, I mean, what they, obviously Twitter and other things, a part of the picture. I left out one other resource country, by the way, in the discussion. I just want to mention it before turning to Libya. There is another country that apparently might have large resources, a country called Israel. And off the coast of Israel is what's now called the Levant gas region. There have been big discoveries. Israel has, I think it's the third biggest gas discovery since the year 2000. Some of the policies that, and that's significant because the gas supply from Egypt to Israel is now in jeopardy. The Israeli government has made some bad decisions in terms of tax policy and so forth, or problematic decisions that may slow it down. But recently now, Lebanon, backed by Hezbollah, there's now an argument about where is the maritime border between those two countries. And you can be sure, as the scale of the resource and the knowledge of the resource, which people thought dry holes for years and years, no resource there, that's going to become another hot issue because of this scale of the resource. On Libya, I'd like to yield my time to my left and my right.
Well, I think we should save Jane, because then we can really get into the heart of American policy. But I think, how do you assess what's going on in Libya, and in particular the United States' decision to intervene? And what do you think it predicts in terms of our behavior towards other countries?
I mean, because we were involved militarily in Libya, which showed the limits of air power once again, or military power in general, this is making it easier for us, difficult actually for us to put pressure on Syria and on Yemen, because people are seeing in Libya the limits of American power and NATO power. I mean, NATO is the mightiest military alliance in the world, and it could be destroyed in places like Yemen, Afghanistan and Libya, which is incredible. It tells you something about American leadership too. I mean, unless the Americans are leading NATO, NATO is not as effective as people think. And the performance of NATO without American leadership in Libya was really, I wouldn't say pathetic, but Libya is a fourth-rate military power. And the major European powers cannot bring that regime down, which is really fascinating in and of itself. And I think most people, including myself, thought that this will take only a few weeks, because Libya, although it is huge, it's the size of Texas and Oklahoma together probably, but essentially most people live on the, in the coastal areas. And 4 or 5 months into the fight, Gaddafi still holed up in Tripoli. There is a slight chance that if the Europeans show signs of weakness, like the French maybe, that Libya could be divided. And keep in mind, Libya as a modern nation state, it's a new country, it's a relatively young country. Libyan nationalism was forged during the struggle against Italian occupation. Libya is a country that was cobbled up by Cyrenaica in the east, where Benghazi lies, Tripolitania in the west, where Tripoli lies, and then Fezzan in the south. So it's not really a very well integrated country. And again, tribal affiliations are important, and regional loyalties are important. So people should keep that in mind when we talk about Libya. I think now NATO is stuck in Libya, and I think in the end they will continue the job until Gaddafi is gone. But this is going to be very costly, and again, it shows the limits of military power. The interesting thing is that Gaddafi alienated every Arab and every Muslim country and most African countries, most of his neighbors, because he intervened in Chad and in Uganda and everywhere. So it was easy for the Arab League to give its blessing, if you will, to NATO to intervene. But this is an exceptional case, and I think Obama's initial reluctance to intervene, he was correct, but I really didn't think, I really felt that, and I was told that this administration did not want to see another Srebrenica, on its watch. And they were really concerned that Benghazi will fall and that there will be mass killing of people. And the White House did not want to have this thing on its watch. And that's one reason the president reluctantly intervened.
When you address this from the point of view you're going to address it from, I'd love you to address that human rights argument, which is, we're protecting lives by doing this. Because bringing up Srebrenica and that version of, at the point of a gun, as David Reeve called it. And just, if you could elaborate on that a little bit.
Srebrenica, as I think everybody understands, was one of the most appalling massacres in recent history. But to remind us all, it happened after we put in place a no-fly zone. So I believe that that kind of massacre could still happen in Libya. I mean, Gaddafi's forces have been severely degraded. He has no air power, but there certainly are rumors that he has saved an enormous amount of ammunition and that he has mercenary forces in the south of the country, and he's still there. And so I think we have no strategic interests in Libya. And nobody called me up and said, Jane, should we get involved? But we have, the humanitarian crisis is an important thing. We had other levers we could have played, and I think it does set up this situation where we look completely disingenuous when we don't intervene in Syria, which is doing the same thing, or in Bahrain, or in, well, let's see what happens in Saudi Arabia over time. So sort of my bottom line is that we were, I don't want to say, well, in some ways we were dragged into this. The French were insistent. And I think that the French agenda there in Libya had more to do with migration, frankly, than it did with an interest in the humanitarian crisis. We don't have a migration problem from Libya, to be blunt about it. And so the French wanted us to get involved. We used the Arab League and so forth as justification, but the Arab League has basically done nothing that I'm aware of, and none of the Arab countries that we're going to send in resources has done anything. I think the UAE was going to send in a few planes. I don't know if they did.
UAE planes and Qatari planes, and they really
did do it.
They
what,
did
5 planes, 3 planes?
Well, I mean, they don't
okay.
have.
But I understand. But they have significant resources. So NATO is we're sort of half in. Gaddafi is still there. There was a report in Izvestia last week by a senior Russian official who said that Gaddafi said, I mean, this is double or triple hearsay, but hey, that if Tripoli's about to fall, he will use all the missiles he has left and blow up the city. Want to talk about a humanitarian crisis? That is far worse than Srebrenica.
Right. Jane, can I just ask, what do you recall your meeting with him in the tent?
Oh yeah, want to hear about the meeting in the tent? Yeah, so fly from Washington, get this, nonstop to Sirte, that's this ancestral village where he grew up, with a small number of Congress people. I've been to Libya twice. The second time, I passed up the opportunity to meet with Gaddafi. I know, don't be upset with me, but so we got there in the morning after flying all night.
What year is this?
In the last decade.
It would have been after 2004.
Yeah, it was after
2003.
Yes, yes, he was caught red-handed. The British intelligence discovered WMD on ships headed for Libya, and he was embarrassed, and then he gave up his WMD program. So it was probably 2004. Anyway, we fly Sirte, which is a very modest place. And we spend all day being driven around in Mercedes at 100 miles an hour in a caravan, don't ask, to see modest ministers. The thing was a joke. And then finally, about 6 o'clock, they still said, well, the great leader, whatever he's called, is not available yet. Apparently, the guy stays up all night and sleeps most of the day. But at any rate, I, quiet, modest person that I am, announced, well, we're leaving, because we were planning to leave Sirte and go to an overnight somewhere else, which is what we did do. We're leaving in 1 hour, and we're now going to head for the airport. And all of a sudden, somebody said, oh, well, he'll be available in 20 minutes. So back in the Mercedes, driving 100 miles an hour through dusty sand and whatever, and I'm thinking, this is like a mafia hit. We're never going to get out of here. My poor son, Brian, my yet-to-be-born grandchildren. It looks like a mirage. There's a tent. It looks like a Cirque du Soleil tent with points. And we finally get there. We're ushered into this tent. It's got rugs all over the floor and big couches. You know, the sort of non-Western way of holding meetings is you sit in couches all facing in the same direction. So it had a huge couch. And then in the corner, it has a little plastic chair that looked like it came from, you know, some discount drugstore. And finally, Gaddafi comes in wearing blankets and a pillbox hat and a wig. It was out of, you know, some bizarre film. And he sits in that little plastic chair because apparently he had some back problem. And then he starts lecturing us, and we get a copy of his little green book. But then we get a copy of his other book in English. And he has an interpreter, but of course he keeps correcting the interpreter in English. The other book is called Isra'tine, and it is the Gaddafi view of Israel-Palestine, which is that the landmass is much too small to have two countries, so we should have Isra'tine, and everyone should have a vote, and then, you know, everyone who lives there should vote, and that should be a democracy. End of story. I mean, think about that. What does that do to the Jewish state of Israel? Yeah, you got it. And that was the meeting. And then we got on the plane and left.
Dan, you avoided your question, but the question for you is, do you agree with Jane that we don't have any U.S. national security interest in Libya? In what we're...
I do, yeah, it does seem that that we backed into it. I mean, we were kind of dragged into it, and it was supposed to be over very quickly, and it's not been over. And what the outcome will be is still very unclear. And so I think that probably a lot of people involved in the decision-making were reluctant. I think the argument about the imminent human rights disaster was what drove it. But the immigration issue for France, for Italy, that looms so large for them, and it's, again, something we don't see, but it's kind of front and center for them, and I think a very powerful motivator.
It's kind of interesting because it's, you know, we haven't been the best collaborators in terms of the international scene. We've kind of been doing things on our own, so now we sort of come in on the tails of the Europeans. It's a little weird. I want to turn to Yemen in terms of I want to ask you the same question about Yemen, because I know you've talked about the al-Qaeda threat and how you see the various Americans, actually, who have embedded themselves in Yemen as spokespersons for al-Qaeda. So it's not just unrelated to that. But I'm thinking in the wider sphere of what you do in terms of wealth, politics, energy resources. How does the Yemen issue play out? Does it play out? What's our...
Well, I think if, you know, in the 1960s, there was a Egyptian war in Yemen that had a big impact really on Saudi Arabia. And I think that, as you know, the bin Laden family was originally Yemeni. The populations have moved back and forth and so forth. So I think a chaotic Yemen, or Yemen, as you said, at ground zero, I mean, that key choke point that leads up to the Suez Canal is there. A whole host of things that you can see that if the impact on, you know, Saudi Arabia's, you know, produces 9 million barrels a day, it would be very, very critical. And so I think I've heard Saudis say that their fear is that Yemen will be their Afghanistan, but it's their Afghanistan next door to them.
So you largely see it as an issue of Saudi Arabia, and therefore.
Well, I see that,
okay.
the global implications of that, combined with whether it is, the major staging area in the way that Jane described for Al Qaeda,
Right.
and a free hand there, which is what could be the outcome of this kind of chaotic situation.
Which is also very interesting, because if you have to pick a beginning to the war on terror as we got to know it, misnamed as it may have been, you probably would have picked the bombing of the USS Cole, something that we never really addressed, which was all about Yemen and its relationship with Saudi. So it's just sort of interesting how this comes full circle. One quick last question for each of you, and then we're going to turn to the audience. It's not a fair question, so that's okay.
Do we have to give fair answers?
Yeah, no. Yes, you have to give fair answers. Which is, project this out. We're all stuck in the moment of reading the paper, listening to the news every day, and saying, what happened today? Who's in their country? Who's out of their country? Is Gaddafi still there? But project it out beyond the moment. What do you see 5 years, 10 years down the road for where the pieces are going to fall? And I know you're not a predictor, but predict anyway.
Well, I think there are two things. One is that we haven't quite said, but one consequence of what's happening, that we had an ossified system. Was it 30 years that Mubarak was in power?
Yeah.
Salah, 33 years, going on 33 years.
Tomorrow,
the Assad family.
Ali 23.
Right. So, but what's happened now is the kind of geostrategic foundations of the region, in a very significant way, has created, if not a vacuum, has been upended. We don't know how that's going to play out. And yes, Mubarak, you described the internal problems, but he was more or less an ally. Obviously, it was a very difficult question how the U.S. should position itself. And I think in the morning, Frank Wisner told him to stay in power, and in the afternoon, he was told to leave by the U.S. And clearly, that affects other people's confidence in the region in terms of what to expect. A very difficult set of decisions to make. Also, Turkey's role in the region is changing. It now has a much more Mideast focus. The Erdogan government clearly has an agenda in which it wants to move the country away from kind of its traditional secular position. It's a member of NATO, but it's a lot's changing there. So I think there's that uncertainty. And the other thing that I don't think we've mentioned, or you mentioned it slightly, the word Iran. Because meanwhile, while all of this else is happening, and whatever is happening with the supreme leader and Ahmadinejad, the president right now, Iran does seem to be marching down the road towards a nuclear weapons capability or nuclear weapons. And you can say Pakistan has them, other countries have it, but it's going to be very destabilizing. It's going to lead, it's already started an arms race in the region. Will it lead to a nuclear arms race in the region? What is the command and control? You can say, well, the US and the Soviet Union, but we had a pretty complicated system of dialogue and communication systems, hotlines that we don't even understand how the decision making is made in Iran. And so I think there will be the day that it seems clear that Iran has nuclear weapons and the capability to deliver them, it's going to kind of be a shock to the whole region. It's kind of off the agenda now since January, but I think it's something that's going to come back on the agenda and will be one of the dominant factors in the next 5 years.
Hisham, you want to sum up for us on your predictions for the 5 years out?
I think in the next 5 years we will continue this transition. Maybe it's a heresy to quote Lenin in this group. Lenin, the old rascal, had a wonderful observation about history. He said sometimes decades pass and nothing happens. And sometimes in weeks, decades happen. And what happened in Egypt and Tunisia, in a few weeks, really, in terms of the changes, really decades happens. And I think it will take the Arabs years and probably decades to sort out what began in the last few months. And that's why it is extremely difficult to predict. But when I look around and we're talking about leadership, the problem, one of the characteristics of Arab politics in the last 30, 40 years was the lack of clear and strong leadership. And the strong leaders that we had were autocratic leaders like Mubarak, and in Saudi Arabia we had Faisal, and Egypt had Nasser. But at this stage today, the Arab world is bereft of strong leaders, leaders with vision. And that's why they find themselves in a defensive posture vis-a-vis Iran and vis-a-vis Turkey in particular, not to mention Israel for that matter. So that leadership weakness is likely to continue with us, even if you have the best prediction about Egypt in the next few years. Even if the Egyptians sort out their problems now and try to rebuild, they're going to be busy with their own domestic problems, rebuilding their economy, rebuilding their society. The same thing in Syria and Yemen, other places, assuming the best outcome, assuming that there is, even in Libya, that Gaddafi is out, and Libya is going to be wounded for a long time. The same thing in Egypt and Tunisia and all of these states. So what you're going to have is a vacuum of leadership, which is going to drag in the United States to be more involved, because also the Turks, who are, supposedly friends with the United States, and they're still up to a certain point, and it's a NATO power, but Turkey is moving in a different direction. There's a different trajectory for the Turkish politics under Erdogan. And then you have the Iranian influence. And in the last few years, unfortunately, Iran has become a Mediterranean power because of its support for Syria, because of its sponsorship of Hezbollah in Lebanon. It's because of support for Hamas in Gaza. So if you look at the Eastern Mediterranean, Iran, which is not an Eastern Mediterranean power, has become a Mediterranean power, in part because of the dearth of leadership on the Arab side, particularly in Egypt. Egypt, a country of 80 million people, 7,000-year history, could not even influence events in Gaza. I mean, that gives you an idea. And yet here you have Iran becoming involved, playing a leadership position, and the Turks. Today, when you look at Syria, you see the two most influential countries in the region who are trying to determine the outcome of Syria are the Turks in the north and the Iranians in the east. Not the United States, not the Europeans, not others. So this is going to make the conditions in the Arab world even, worse, because there is no leadership. And this is going to put a great deal of pressure on the United States to become more and more involved when the United States does not have reliable Arab political structures to deal with. And because they're going to be busy with their own problems, domestic problems, and then you have a belligerent Iran and a more assertive Turkey.
Can I just add, one thing quickly, which is that, it was striking that one of the very first things that happened when the Mubarak government fell was that opened the Suez Canal to the passage of Iranian warships into the Mediterranean, making exactly your point that, a mixed signal, but a strong signal, and that the strategic balance that we knew was gone.
And they also opened the tunnels and access into Gaza. Let me just make a couple of points. Henry Kissinger has said that the Arab Spring is Act 1 of a 3-act play, but we don't know what Acts 2 and 3 are. And I think we don't. And I think American influence generally is pretty limited. We should project one unified set of values across the region and try to abide by that. But we should only intervene where we have strategic interests. And I think that's in a very limited number of countries. Pakistan, I'm not talking about military intervention, Pakistan is a mess, and it has 100 nukes, and it hates us at the moment, and that's not a good picture, and we have to try to fix that. Yemen we've discussed. Yemen to me is ground zero in terms of attacks against us. To remind, al-Awlaki is an American Yemeni, and he and a couple of other folks are hiding out in the boonies writing English language materials which are on the web. There's something called Inspire Magazine, which has a chapter called How to Build a Bomb in the Kitchen of Your Mom. And there's lessons in how to encrypt messages. And there are folks in America who may or may not be born Muslim, and I'm not saying you only have to be Muslim to become some kind of a radical activist, because we have a huge history of non-Muslims doing this. But nonetheless, there are folks surfing the web who are alienated, who are trying things. And fortunately, we've found many of them, not all of them. The Fort Hood shooter was not found before he caused the damage that he caused. But I think it's just a matter of time. There's no 100% protection against this. When some folks, one more, will launch conventional attacks in this country, having been inspired by these materials on the web. So that's the grim news about Yemen. And then Iran is the big enchilada. We really do have to make sure that our strategy against Iran is as effective as possible. The sanctions are working. The government is having problems. They're rationing goods. Ahmadinejad's in trouble. I don't know what comes after him. It may be something as bad or worse, but nonetheless, the Persians they're not a majority in the country. They talk about a country that has a variety of folks in there. There are opportunities, one would think, to change Iranian policy without intervening militarily, which I think has a huge day after problem. But finally, I want to mention Israel-Palestine one more time. I think the clock is ticking against Israel as a Jewish state. I think that the Israeli government is dug in against negotiations in the near term, and I am very sad about that. I don't think that is the best policy, and I think if those of us in America who are strongly pro-Israel, and I'm certainly one of those people, can criticize that policy without being I guess some will label us anti-Israel, but I think that's unfair. Our interests are a little different from theirs, and our interests, I think, are to see a stable Israel that survives as a Jewish state in a neighborhood that increasingly hates Israel. Let's understand, Israel's good friends are not there. What happened to Egypt? Turkey was very hostile. It's now warming up some. Jordan, the king of Jordan, has a lot of domestic problems, and I don't know that he can be relied upon to be the friend of Israel that he was, and the rest of the neighborhood doesn't like Israel so much, and Europe is now, at least as I observe it, becoming, I wouldn't say anti-Israel, but certainly less tolerant, and the UN is probably going to do something in September to recognize a Palestinian state. That won't have the force and effect of law, but it won't be a good day for Israel. And so, and what is Congress doing, by the way? Congress is supporting Netanyahu's policy on a bipartisan basis and cutting off aid to Palestine. And that small amount of aid has enabled the Abbas government to develop some at least pretty effective local governance capability, which is a good thing for Israel's security. So I just want to conclude with saying that we have a limited number of interests. I think we need to focus harder on those and deploy our scarce resources, including our brain cells, against those interests, and otherwise back off more, except for a counterterrorism policy. If we know that Al-Qaeda is grouping someplace, I think we have every right to go against it.
Which might bring into question just how the U.S. government assesses threat and national security interests and what the metrics and criteria of it are, but we won't go